Welcome to For Every Response, the podcast from Emergency Services Times, sponsored by MSA Safety. In this series, we bring you sessions from the Emergency Services Show and the Emergency Tech Show 2025. In our second episode with the British Safety Industry Federation, the panel looks at tender specifications. They argue that they are critical to securing the right products that deliver the quality and performance that teams need. Listen on to get insights into how robust tendering ensures end users get what they truly need.
My name's Natalie Wilson. I'm founder of Workwear Solutions. We are a technical consultancy company that provides support to end users to help them develop specifications and go through the tender process. And I'm also involved in a lot of standards, which we've talked about in terms of the inclusive standard that's just been released, and PPE as well. So I'd like to introduce Amy. She was also here, but in a different chair in the last panel.
I was. I've moved up one. Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, I don't think so. My name's Amy Beams. I have been an operational firefighter for the last 21 years, got some wealth of experience in terms of PPE. I'm currently one of the directors of Women in the Fire Service, which means our network connects us with all females across the fire and rescue services, so we have a really good inroad to that end user data.
Thanks, Chris.
Chris Butcher. I work for BTTG in Manchester in the UK. We're a UK approved body. Specialist in certification and testing of protective clothing and gloves, especially firefighter PPE.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Alan?
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Chris. My name's Alan Murray. I, for the last 12 years, have managed the British Safety Industry Federation, which is a trade body that embraces all the manufacturers, importers, distributors of PPE and safety equipment, and also within our membership are all the approved and notified bodies. So I think we are kind of unique in the marketplace. We have, to some extent, the whole supply chain, but we are also reaching out and speaking to industry most of the time, and we have about 100 duty holder members of the Federation, so they would be employers and duty holders. A couple of fire and rescue services as well.
Perfect, thank you. So as I said, we're going to be talking about specifications and the importance of them. I think one observation, I've been in the industry 20 years now, and one thing that I have observed is that there's definitely been a change in terms of some of the technical knowledge and expertise that has been in the public sector previously, where you had kind of what I affectionately call the lifers, who were the PPE manager for a police service or a fire and rescue service for 20, 30, even 40 years. And there was a lack of succession planning, perhaps, to allow their knowledge to be passed on before they retired out of the industry. So I think specifications is a really interesting topic. We kind of look at two different types of specifications that we would kind of define, and there's we'll talk about what those are and what the implications of them are. So we would talk about input specifications and output specifications. So for us, an input specification is where we say we're going to do some development for a female and male. We're going to do the station wear development, and we're going to engage with the client. We're going to understand what it is they're doing, that they need a pocket to fit a certain piece of equipment in that needs to be in there. And we would develop a specification that basically would allow that product to be developed and for that to be sent straight into a factory by a tenderer to go and sample it. So you've got sampling on exactly the same level. You've given lots of detail around the sizing, which is where we can do some kind of fit testing and things. So it's a really detailed specification. It's got everything put into it. The other side is what we call an output specification, and that's usually driven by minimum performance requirements. So it might be a piece of PPE, particularly if you've got kind of commercially off-the-shelf products as opposed to something that's being developed and designed specifically for that particular user or tender. And the way that you approach those things is quite different, but are really important. And the main piece is that if you don't know what you need to put in your specification, how do you know what you're going to get, or that you are going to get something that you want at the end of the process. So Amy, I really wanted to talk to you about some of the input that you've been able to give, or some of the feedback that might end up going into a specification to help that procurement process and help people understand what it is that you actually want as women in the fire service, for example.
Thanks, Nat. So I suppose from an end user point of view, it's really being open to that conduit of information of actually what do we want? What is the role? The role of a firefighter has changed considerably over the last few years. There are many, many more roles within the service other than an operational, as in going to a fire. There's a considerable rescue, there's water rescue, there's technical kit. And it's about understanding what that kit needs to do, and actually who is then going to be wearing that kit and operating that kit, and how that kit interfaces with each other. So it might be that if you're looking at a single item of PPE, it might fit and function on its own, but actually when you start adding or laying that into other items of PPE, what's that compatibility? How does that functionality actually work? And one of the examples we use is our fire tunics, and currently the difference between a male and female fire tunic is the way that the storm flap opens. So they have a zip, and the male flap closes one way and the female flap closes the other way. So you wouldn't really think that that causes much of an issue, but actually when you then start layering on a breathing apparatus set, and actually you've got your radio on one side and your torch on the other, depending on what you're doing, actually one side catches and the other side doesn't. So you think, why on earth have we developed a garment that is actually a hindrance because of the way that it opens, just so that we can say we've developed something for female firefighters, which actually just seems absolutely bonkers. It's a bit like, well, if we had one way of opening it, and then we could do all the compatibility tests in a single, surely that's going to reduce cost, it's going to reduce time, and then we're not having to duplicate all of these processes for two different separate items. So when we're talking about the compatibility and fit, it's really understanding, like, have you gone out and asked your crew? Have you gone out and asked that end user? Have you got a really good spectrum of that end user? Because actually a new firefighter coming in might have a different experience with that kit than somebody that has been in 15, 20 years. So actually, what is their understanding of that kit and how do they go about using it? And I think a lot of where we're moving towards now about collecting this data and this data-centric sort of actually looking at sizing around that, how can we use that to then help influence the design of fire kit and look at that specification and say, do you know what, we only need it to do X and Y, but we're currently making it do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, just so that we can kind of badge it as we're being inclusive and we've got something for everybody. And so it's really driving down and understanding what that kit needs to do and who it's for, rather than just this very generic approach of, oh, we'll do something and it'll make do for everybody.
And it's interesting, I found out only very recently the reason that female that female garments open the opposite way. It's because back in the day when ladies were dressed by other ladies, it was easier for the person dressing someone to do it if they were right-handed. So they switched the way round. And here we are in 2025 and we haven't changed that or considered why we do it. And it's interesting because you say, like, from an operational firefighter point of view, what's the difference? What is it doing? But in some instances where we've looked at developing product for people who haven't had, so in the military, for example, where everyone's been wearing the same kit and it's been based on a male form and doesn't fit properly. When we've developed kit that opens the other way, it's a really clear sign to them that they've got something different. So depending on what stage you are in inclusivity and whether that would cause any differences, for the military piece where we did it, it didn't make any difference, but it psychologically made a difference that they were wearing female kit instead of male kit. But in your instance, absolutely the opposite is actually, let's look at it from, we're wearing lots of different things and coordinating it, which is why it's so important to understand the end use of that product when you're developing specifications, and as a buyer when you're putting specifications out to market, to make sure you can do it. Now the other bit that's hotly contested in specifications is testing and certification, and we've seen some really ugly examples of really, really old standards still being specified, which kind of goes back to my kind of earlier comment about people who were in those roles for such a long time that maybe didn't pass on updated information. And that's where Chris and your team come in. So in terms of your point of view from specifications or things that you've been asked to test for within a tender process, what have kind of been like the good, the bad, the ugly kind of experiences from your point of view?
Yes.
Question.
Just in a nutshell.
Old standards is a good one.
Yeah.
the company's got a specification they've had for 20 years and it refers to standards that were old when it was written. Nobody tests that test anymore with 3 versions on. That's often the sort of thing. Military, that stays forever, but anything outside of military, then we develop standards. The test gets changed. So we're often saying, we can't do that. Nobody here knows how to do that test. We stopped doing that decades ago.
Yeah. And I guess that's a really good example of where we need buyers to be engaging with industry earlier on in the process, because the challenge that we hear very often from the buyer side is, but we can't talk to anyone because we're going into a tender process. Well, before you go into the tender process, you can talk to whoever you like about whatever you like. It's only once your PQQ goes out that you have to stop that. Yeah. So I think there's a misconception that if you've got a tender coming up in 12 months' time, that you can't talk to anyone apart from your current supplier. And your current supplier is going to tell you what they do, and they're not going to tell you what everyone's doing because they won't know it, frankly, in some cases. Yeah. So the testing piece is really interesting. From the buyer side, the other education piece is timelines. And it's always a shock to people that you aren't standing around waiting to test stuff that they're going to send in tomorrow. So what would you say in terms of like some feedback to industry and to buyers that from a testing point of view you would need?
To specifiers, for tenders, talk to us. It takes time. If you're expecting 3 or 4 companies to need testing and to get testing, then it takes time. If you want 50 washes and you want line drying, it's 1 wash a day. That's 5 a week. That's 10 weeks of washing. So these things take time. And if everybody's coming to us or any laboratory at the same time, you need to tell us, you need to ask us what's possible. We can tell you what we can do, what you can expect, rather than everybody frantically trying to get through. So we're happy to talk to anybody in terms of their tender, their specification, not only in terms of timelines, but does this make sense? I've asked for this test and this test, do I need both tests? We're happy to give our expert opinion. If you're asking for a certain test, a certain requirement, it may be incompatible with a different standard that you're also asking for. We're happy to look at these things and say, well, you can have that, but you won't get that. Or you can go for that, but you won't get that. You have to make a decision. So talk to us, basically.
And I think that's really helpful because when either in tender processes that people are asking for fully certified products, which means you're limiting the market only to the people who've already developed it. But there are certain things that you can ask for within the testing that will show you that the chances of that product reaching that certification process would be good, but the testing needs to happen in the first place. So also thinking about what's reasonable from a buyer perspective of saying you need a fully certified product in 6 weeks, it's just not going to happen. And that's really important. And I think the education piece, Alan, is where BSIF really come in. You talked about your duty holder members and the engagement that you have with those. And I know that you've been developing some new education for buyers.
Yeah, we have. So BSIF members and their front-facing staff have to have a qualification in PPE, the regulations that go along with that. But we're now taking that forward to people who are sourcing and specifying PPE. And that deals with all the regulatory issues. It probably doesn't take it into the science of tendering. Mm-hmm. But it's meant to be a foundation course. I'm slightly surprised that the people who are here today representing emergency personnel, who deserves good PPE more than emergency personnel? I can't think of many, frankly. So I'm surprised to hear some of the challenges within the process. I really am. But we're developing the education piece, because decision making is typically, as we were talking about earlier, somewhere between health and safety, active function and purchasing. And sometimes the purchasing people aren't exposed to enough information relevant to the personal protective equipment. So that's what we're doing. Now that will be the regulatory side, then sector specific, as in head, eye, respiratory, footwear, and so on. But we probably need to take it further along if you were developing this type of process. That would be very much a buying science, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things on there. I think making sure that the emergency services buyers are educated in some of the basics of PPE is really helpful, and I don't mean that in any disrespect to any of the buyers, but we also know that buyers are having to buy uniform and fire engines and stationery and everything else that goes into a building that you'd be operating in. So you can't possibly reasonably expect an individual or a small team of individuals to have in-depth knowledge on all of those things enough to feel like experts in it. And I think giving them offering that training so that they at least begin to know what they don't know and then can be directed to people who might be able to help with those other things is a really, really key step from where we are now.
So I was going to give a parallel back to COVID time, which was a chaotic time for personal protective equipment, as you know. But the health service and the health service personnel who were really frontline did not understand personal protective equipment from the point of view of the user. They understood patient protection. So the masks that you saw, the little blue masks, are about protecting the patient from the doctor or from the nurse. So it was a completely new universe to the health service when COVID came. And we found ourselves designing all sorts of training, pretty much on the hoof, to be honest. But we were writing training on behalf of the health and safety executive for GP surgeries.
Yeah.
All these people who had never used PPE. So the ignorance around PPE, what it can do, what it can't do, ensembles that it should be used, complementary PPE. It's really quite basic. So our first qualification for users is called sourcing safety. But we'll need to take it further, Natalie, to address some of the specifics that are here.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Starting with that basic information is at least a good place to start. And I think you might find that the procurement experience of those teams will just dovetail into they'll know the procurement piece, and then understanding some of the things that they need to ask for, I think is really important.
Well, I think an absolute basic, each category will be left with 3 key things that you want to ask your supplier.
Yeah. And we sometimes have it when we're talking to our buyer clients who are saying things like, well, I don't think we can ask them to provide us with test reports, or suppliers saying, no, we don't need to provide you with the certificates. And it's absolutely reasonable and in some cases legally required for them to do some of those things. So I think empowering buyers to understand what they can ask for and what's reasonable to ask for is really important. And I take the view, as I said earlier, I've been in the industry for 20 years, and about 3 years ago, we started exclusively working with buyers to help them go through these procurement processes. And some of the information that they had was really outdated, and some of the information they had they just didn't know what they could ask for. And in asking for more things, in asking for some of the test reports, what has happened is that people have been eliminated earlier on in the process. So you invest quite heavily in the front end to get the specifications as you need them to be, so that when you go through the tender process, you do eliminate the people who just can't meet the standards or don't have the knowledge for it. We had one example where we were told it was a perfect example of one of those fantastic companies that pivoted during COVID, and they went from supplying medical PPE to win in a contract for some motorcycle PPE, but had never heard of the PPE regulations. And I was just shaking to my core, going, before we do anything, let me just check a few things. And that was like pure innocence on the buyer. And because they didn't know what questions to ask or how to specify something in a way that would have eliminated that person from being able to do it. And I'm talking, I'm not talking about a small organization here, really professional organization that were buying that sort of thing. So yeah, it's always interesting when you get to those ones.
Just to say, Natalie, that to a buyer, there are certain restrictions on what everybody is naturally allowed to see. So a declaration of conformity, everyone should see.
Yeah.
A certificate of approval and any other supporting test information can be demanded by an enforcement agency. But commercial pressures are such that you can ask anything of your supplier. And if they are unwilling to provide it to you, that's a flag.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's my point as well. Like, I had a micro manufacturing business for 8 years. And my view is when we're putting specifications together, if I could have provided that information, a company that's trying to win a 30 million euro contract, damn better be able to provide that information as well. And the ones that don't want to do it or that don't, or say you can't really ask that, it's not reasonable, they're the ones for me that, as I say, are a real red flag. So this is a really good example of where you can build a really robust specification process and specification into your tender process, where just by asking for a few more things, you can eliminate people who, do you want to be working with someone who won't be transparent with you about where their products are made? And when digital product passports come in 2027, they're not going to be able to do that anyway. So that's another thing that needs to be starting to be put into specifications, is DPP requirements. We talked about inclusivity in the last section. Thinking about how we might specify that in a tender process, what kind of feedback would you give, things that you would like to see put in, or ways that you'd like people to engage as they're developing specifications? From a user, because I don't know if you said you were an operational firefighter.
I'm an operational firefighter.
Yeah.
So I think from the end user point of view, it's the request to the services to collect that data and actually to have that conversation before you start that tendering process and that specification. And actually, we unfortunately quite often see that you've already got somebody in mind or a particular kit in mind because you've been to a show and you've seen it and you think it's great. And then when you actually ask your end users, that sort of information might not necessarily tally up, and yet actually you already started down the process with somebody. So do you know what, we're just going to carry on down that process. And I think sometimes it's about being brave and kind of going, do you know what, actually that might have been a mistake. What we should have done first was take that little bit of a step back and to really understand what we're required and listen to that feedback that you're given, because the person on the ground, male or female, knows how that kit works, knows how that kit is supposed to function. And if they're not comfortable and confident with it, then it's absolutely pointless going through that process and going through with that specification. So I think it's just really understanding an individual perspective, and we talked earlier about getting some more data and some bodymetric data, and I think that's where we need to start, is that we need to stop guessing and we need to stop generalizing about whether you're small, medium or large, and actually really start to understand the type of people that we're employing and the type of body shapes that we're employing, so that actually we can then make and specify kit to fit those people. And this isn't necessarily about saying that all emergency services should have completely bespoke individual kit for every single individual, because that's clearly just not practical. But it is about how do we move away from that one standard fits all, and actually how do we then develop the interoperability between different services. And it's not just fire and rescue, it's all of the emergency services. And I think when we start looking at that as a bigger platform than just the individual service or the individual sector, we're going to get much more buy-in into actually how do we reflect the needs of those individuals on that wider platform.
This episode of the Emergency Services Times podcast is sponsored by MSA Safety, proudly supporting emergency services and first responders on the front line. At MSA Safety, protecting first responders isn't just what we do, it's who we are. We work closely with fire and rescue services across the UK to develop and deliver safety solutions designed to meet your ever-evolving needs. That includes MSA Bristol Firefighter PPE, trusted by services across the UK and beyond, shaped through years of collaboration with frontline teams. It also includes our growing investment in innovation and technology, from the connected M1 SCBA modular solution to our agile, fully managed service model that helps keep crews protected and ready to respond. But for us, safety goes beyond equipment. We believe in standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who dedicate their lives to protecting others, whether it's supporting firefighter charities, backing mental health initiatives, or showing up for community events. MSA is proud to be part of the emergency services family. To learn more about our work in the UK and how we're supporting first responders every step of the way, visit www.msasafety.com. With MSA Safety, when you go in, we go in with you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And when you say, we don't understand what we're putting product in and we're going down that route, as you said earlier, 97% of the female firefighters you surveyed said that their kit didn't fit, and it was across the board.
Yes.
So there's clearly something going wrong in the specification end if what is coming out is still not fit for purpose. And that engagement, I think, is really important. In order to be able to do that. Alan, I can see you shaking your head.
No, I'm agreeing. I should be nodding.
Yeah.
I mean, providing suitable and adequate PPE is fundamental. These items are provided because you're putting people in a hazard. Mm-hmm. And good PPE, well specified, well thought through, with wearer engagement, will keep them safe, right?
Yeah.
But you will get appreciation. Appreciation leads to higher morale. Higher morale leads to more productivity, perhaps. But in emergency services and beyond, it's just the right thing to do.
Mm. And I think if you are not specifying the right product because you haven't engaged, what you're actually doing, which is one of the key things that came out through the inclusivity standard, is that you're putting people at risk. So they're at risk of additional trips or hazards or snags that will cause further injury. And I know footwear is a big area where actually that can cause long-term spinal damage if you're wearing the wrong footwear and it's A, heavier, and B, not fitting you, you're holding yourself differently. So there's some really long-term issues that needs to be addressed through things like this. And as I say, for me, I think testing and certification is a really key part of that. That's something we would always put in our requirements, in our specifications when we're developing them for products, is saying things like, here's your durability aspects, here's your colour fastness. And that's just to make sure that you've got a product that's going to last as well, because what you also don't want by not specifying enough is, trousers failing on the ground, or, officers not being able to get out of a car because they've just ripped their trousers as they're getting out because the seam strength wasn't tested and we didn't know what that was going to look like. So there's lots of other non-PPE related testing that is a really critical part, and something that the test houses can really support with as well. So is that something that you see a lot of, that sort of testing as well, or more just around the PPE standards?
It isn't something we see a lot of, but I think we should.
Yeah.
Because just complying with the standard, the existing EN, ISO, BS standard, just getting a CE mark or a UK CE mark, that's the minimum requirements just to get the mark, just to sell the product. It doesn't mean it's a good product. It means it meets the minimum requirements of those standards.
Yeah.
So things like actual lifetime, actual durability, whether it fits. I mean, in terms of clothing, I'm sure it's the same in terms of lots of other PPE. We look at a minimum size range, and as long as we've satisfied it fits one person, or maybe two person, or a small range of people, that's it, CE mark. We're not looking at, because it's not a legal requirement. It isn't. You could say it probably is covered in the regulation, but the standards we're using at the moment don't require the manufacturers to look at it in order to get that legal minimum standard.
Yeah, and the high visibility standard is a good example where you only have to have things washed 5 times to get it certificated. Well, if you've got a polo shirt that's a high vis polo shirt, you might wash that 5 times in a month if you've got enough allocation and you're rolling like through it. And that's another point in sort of the tender process and working out what it is you need to buy, is thinking about the appropriate allocations so that product can last. But I would be surprised if most buyers, they might know that they need to specify EN 20471. Do they know which version of it? Do they know that it's under review? Do they know what the implications are? And do they know that you only have to have it washed 5 times? And is that what you want your product to last to? Because that's where you're driving down the cost, which ends up being more expensive in the long run because you're replacing things more. And you're just not going to be able to continue to do that in the kind of environment and environmental legislation that's coming through to be able to do it. So yeah, there's a lot in specifications, and sometimes it, as I said earlier, it breaks my heart when we see a specification for a pair of trousers and it's, or a shirt, and it says polycotton shirt with 2 chest pockets with flaps and a crest, right? Well, I could walk into any fabric mill and find about 50 different versions of a polycotton fabric, and we haven't said anything about colour fastness or how dense you need the fibres to be so it's not see-through, things like that. So that's where specifications can really, really benefit the whole process and make sure that you end up with a product that is fit for purpose for the life of that product. So I think we're ready to take questions, if there are any questions in the audience.
Yeah.
Lovely to look at a sea of blank faces, otherwise not. Sarah.
Not that one, not that one.
It's all right. I like the ones that look like trouble. Sarah, would you like to ask a question? Yes, please. Hey.
Oh, I know.
Thanks.
So, is this working? Sorry. Is it working now? Right, great. Chris.
Sarah.
Hello. Number one standard that you think needs to be reviewed to make sure that specifications of the future are much more improved?
Good question.
Only because I'm going to be asking you to sort it out.
Yes.
Careful how you
Number one standard.
You're writing your own to-do list here, Chris.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Purely for my own
We know
personal...
there are 76 of them that need urgent review because they're not fit for purpose from inclusivity. So you've got a good selection that you could start to choose from, I guess.
Maybe you could help Chris out.
I mean, the one that everybody has been talking to me this exhibition about is the BS 7971 Part 10, the public order, the riot suit. We all know there's issues with that. The Home Office won't engage with us. There's a willingness to review it, to revise it from our point of view, my point of view, and certainly the manufacturers. I'm sure the end users would want it to be looked at, especially with the issue we have with fluorocarbons and the banning of C8 fluorocarbons in terms of chemical protection. So yes, that's needs revision. Whether we can do it or not is another matter.
News, Chris.
Yeah.
That's on my to-do list.
Oh, well, there you go.
BS 7971 series is going to be coming under review for exactly that reason. It has been in place for so long that BSI are asking if it's even valid anymore. So it needs updating, and for all the reasons you said. And you know, when we're talking about that standard, you're talking, for those who don't know, it's the public order standard. So if I'm stood having people throw petrol bombs at me as I'm trying to keep a crowd back, I want to know that my product's been properly specified and that the standard that's being used is fit for purpose to protect me. Because at the minute, there's a question around the effectiveness of that because it's been such a long time. And as you say, there's new environmental legislation coming in around PFAS that is going to have a big impact on that. And also from an inclusivity point of view, because those are particularly rigid products in many cases, which makes it even more challenging to have a range of sizes that fits everyone when you have got those sort of those interesting ones. You also mentioned that I'm not picking on you, I promise. We talked about military standards. You said that don't change. My view is they absolutely need to change, because the operational environments and the types of tasks that soldiers are working within are different today than they were when some of those standards were written. I think I've seen specs dated like 1984, which is just 1 year younger than I am. So we need to look at military standards as well, because I do think they need changing. And PFAS is a massive issue within the military sphere, because at the minute only the oil repellency and grease repellency can only be achieved with PFAS currently. But if a soldier's changing their weapons and cleaning them, they are getting oil and grease on them. And so we have to really think about how do we as standards makers make those improvements, so that when the buyers are putting them in the specifications, we know that they're fit for purpose, or what else needs to be changed. And I think it's a really good point that both of you had said earlier, that the CE marking, or the EN standard that you're specifying as a buyer, is a very minimum performance that product needs to do for you legally to give that to your employees. It doesn't mean it's fit for purpose. It doesn't mean it's got everything considered, as you talked about, Amy, in terms of what else are we wearing it with, and the interoperability of things. So it's why specifications kind of like that, slightly tongue-in-cheek, how to get what you want. It's actually how to get what you need to safely protect your teams, particularly in these industries where you're working on in these really high-pressure, high-risk environments.
So I work for a test inspection certification laboratory. So you've made some interesting points there. In terms of military standards, do you feel that people who are focusing on military that are not completely au fait with what CE marking really is? And do you feel that there's a bit of a neglect and an ignorance to their obligations for CE to align with MILSTAN and DEFSTAN standards?
I don't know is the honest answer to that question. I think there's a perception that military have an exception to CE marking, and that because they don't need it, they sometimes will take a fabric that's been tested, but maybe the seams might not have been tested. And that's, for me, absolutely fundamental when you're talking about those kind of risks. So I think, again, this comes back to educating buyers about what it is that they should be asking for, making sure that they're engaging with industry and with test houses, as we talked about, before they start the tender process, so that they can start it. And it sounds like a huge amount of work, because it kind of is, but it saves you double the amount of work, or the issues of things going wrong, and the amount of money that's spent on ill-fitting PPE that sits in a cupboard somewhere and never gets used. The worst thing you can do is give someone PPE that they don't wear, because then they've got no protection whatsoever.
In my experience, the last 8 years, there tends to be a read-through from MILSTAN and DEFSTAN standards into CE marking. That might be aligned with what I'm into, which is electronics and electrical, but there has been a trend over the last 6 or 7 years to go, yes, we want MILSTAN 461, yes, we want DEFSTAN 59411, but automatically saying, well, this is going to be used in some form of civilian purpose, or it's going to be headed up by somebody who's a civilian. So therefore, CE is required along with the PUWER regulations. So I do see it in some areas, but it's interesting how it's not aligned with simple things like wearing fabrics.
Yeah.
You know, the common day, not everybody's wearing night vision, not everybody's wearing complicated equipment. So I think you've made a pertinent point there, which needs to be addressed.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Hi. So you were talking a lot about how the role of a firefighter's changed and the role of a police officer's changed, and how standards are quite outdated, specifications are outdated. In terms of test methods, how do you feel they're developing in line with how the role is shifting, and the way that we're fighting fires, or the way that we're dealing with police matters? Do you feel like test methods are also developing in line with real life situations?
The short answer to that is probably no. Chris?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah. Or not really, not no.
We did at the last revision of the firefighter suit standard, EN 469. We did the European standard. We did sit down in the committee, the European committee, and say, right, we're going to start with a blank piece of paper. What are the risks? How are we going to test materials that protect against those risks? the standard we came up with was virtually identical to the one we already had. So there is a certain amount of not inertia, but realization that the kit you have does protect you against most hazards you will come up against. And we've talked in the committees about things like molten metal. Do we need to test for molten metal? Do the assemblies sometimes, you will be exposed to molten droplets? And yes, we can test for it, but the kit you've got performs quite well against molten metal. So do we need to add costs to the manufacturing and the testing? Lithium fires, battery fires, are there additional hazards? Possibly. But again, is there a risk, is there a hazard that the kit isn't protecting you against? Probably not. Probably the kit you've got does provide protection against chemicals, against sparks, against mechanical swarf, all the bits that come off. Do we need to have additional tests? Possibly. It takes years to develop that sort of test that's reliable, repeatable. So yeah, it is a constant discussion. But at the moment, there isn't an overwhelming, a view that there is a gap, that there's a hazard that you're not protected against, that we need to look at. So.
And I think it's really interesting one using the structural firefighting kit as an example, because that's almost like the extreme, because we know that that's in some cases been like so over specified, and so like the performance requirements of the fabrics and the whole garments together are so much that actually you end up with different risks, which are around physiological effects of firefighting, overheating, steam burns, that kind of thing. So that's when, like, working with the standard to do things like think about where the tape is placed or what type of tape is being used so it's not creating those steam burns, or how are you layering those fabrics together to allow a bit more breathability. And that's where, again, understanding that the minimum requirements are the minimum requirements, but what else can you ask for within the specification that helps to address some of those other things that might actually, because you're so well protected in that example, what are the secondary risks that have been created by having that protection, and how does that come into like the design process of the product? My comment about not really is because I was thinking about the inclusivity of some of the standards, and we know we talked about it in the earlier one, and I always love to do a bit of glove bashing, but the smallest hand size that's tested for gloves is too big for 86% of women's hands. So that tells me that it's not fit for purpose. And actually one of my jobs within at the European level, so there's a joint technical committee that's joint horizontal committee. So we have all the vertical committees that address all the product technical information, and then this new horizontal committee that's been set up to look at things like sustainability, inclusivity, ensemble testing, that sit across multiple categories of PPE, is where we're starting now to look at those 76 standards that the European Commission have deemed not to be fit for purpose, and we're then looking at the test methods to say what is missing, what isn't inclusive, and why are we putting people in this situation where we've got the wrong thing. And again, it all comes back to specifications. Once you know what you want because you've engaged properly with your workforce, you've looked around at industry to see what the sort of state of the art information is, and you've spoken to the test houses so you understand what you can ask for and what you should be reasonably doing. And not to leave Alan out, so once you've completed the BSAF course as well, then you can go out to market with a specification that you can be really confident is going to get you what you need.
I was going to add to what you were saying, Natalie, about the dangers of overprotection.
Yeah.
You can go. You must understand your risk assessment, what risk you face, and then match your protective equipment against that specific set of risks.
Yeah.
Overprotection is a challenge all on its own.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for your time, everybody. I hope you learned something from that, took something from that away.
Thanks for listening. Remember that by taking time to learn from our speakers, you can earn CPD points from our partner CPDme. So do check out the link in the show notes. Our thanks to MSA Safety for their continued support for our podcast and to Smart Digital for producing this series. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to For Every Response, the podcast from Emergency Services Times.